January 5, 1996, and Pearl is sharing some of her memories of growing up and Grandpa and Grandma's life. Tell me what you remember about Grandpa uh, coming to this country. What do you know about his history?
Okay, I know that my grandfather had a position in Holland that was similar to the FBI. And in Holland they had the class distinction, which we don't have here in the United States. And they still have that like in England and in Europe today, class. And my father was out of school, and my grandfather could not afford to send him on to higher education. And it was below his dignity to have him go work on the farms. So my grandfather decided that he should go to America, the land of opportunity, the land of which everybody thought was the place to go. And so he was only 13 or 14 years old. He made the trip by himself. And my grandmother stood at the front door and was hoping, praying. And my dad would turn around and come back. And he didn't. He just went on, and I can imagine his feeling. And then when he came to this country, why, they knew some people by the name of Zandstrom. Somehow or other there was in those days, Holland wasn't such a big country. And my dad was from Friesland. And my mother was Groningen. And the Fries were all big people. They were on a special, separate island, actually, and that was Friesland. It was an island. But anyway, my dad landed, and he began working for a produce company, and he hauled produce. He also would march the cattle down Michigan Avenue in Chicago, and Michigan Avenue was, at that time, just a dirt road. And he remembers that there was a man by the name of Van Til, Reiner Van Til, who later moved to Highland also, that also was walking these cattle down Michigan Avenue to the stockyards to be butchered. And somehow or other, and we figure that it had to be this way, that my dad was in the produce, and my mother, who had came to the United States with her mother, and with her brother Ben, which would be my Uncle Ben, who was, I think, younger than my mother. They came on the boat, the three of them.
Oh, what happened to her father?
Her father was dead.
Okay.
And my mother had her birthday on the boat. Now, for a long time, they celebrated my mother's birthday on the wrong day. They celebrated it in July. And when they got the papers together and could read the English and everything, they realized that really her birthday was June 8th.
Okay.
And so then...
what year was she born?
well, I don't
Okay.
know
right.
offhand,
We'll go over the
except I
dates
would
later.
have to go back to the day when they were killed, and she was 83
Okay.
when she died. When she passed away in 1969, she was 83 years old. But my mother worked for people by the name of Hoffman, who owned a store, and they were considered quite wealthy. And my mother was kind of like their live-in maid. And this woman, even after my parents were married, would come out every winter and visit my mom and dad, even when they lived on the farm here on Route 41, and I was in grade school. And we always looked forward to them coming because she always brought a bag of candy bars.
Oh.
And that was a big treat. I mean, they were the 5-cent candy bars, which today would probably be the quarter size. And also, they had a daughter by the name of Jenny who had moved to Michigan. And whenever they came out to Roseland, then the Huffmans and Jenny and her husband, don't recall her last name, came out, and us kids would always be so tickled we could hardly wait to come home from school for that candy. But that is where we figure my mother met my dad.
Now, where were they living at the time?
In Roseland.
In Roseland.
They were living in Roseland. And then my mother also had a sister living in Roseland that was married to a Boersma, but was no relative of ours. And her name was Grace. And so I think my dad kind of, got connected with them also. And somehow or other, my mom and dad met and married, and then they lived in Roseland for a while, and then they lived in what they called I think they called it South Hammond in those days, or East Hammond, but it really was South Chicago. And then they moved to Munster. My mom and dad lived on Ridge Road, and I don't know which house, but it's still standing.
Oh, we'll have to dig on that. Okay.
And then they lived in Highland on Kleinman. They had the farm there. And they lived next door to people called Hoeksters. And one day, one of the older boys, when the mom and dad were in church, he decided to go out in the barn. I don't know if he was going to smoke straw or what he was going to do, but anyhow, the whole barn burned up. And the father, of course, was very, very stubborn. That man really, really was unhappy with that boy. And I'm sure it was a week or two before he could sit down again. And then they moved to what you called Hartsdale. And it was called Hartsdale because people by the name of Hart lived here. And there were some other wooden shoes living here. Bush lived on the west side south. Zansters lived on the west side north in Elzingas. And then we had a farm. And it was across the street from a one-room school. And later on, my dad sold that piece of property and moved north to the corner of 41 in Maine. And they built a new home, and I was the first child born in that house. And the house wasn't completed when they had to move out. So my mother and dad lived in the garage. Can you imagine? I was the 10th child.
With their 9 children, and she's expecting
me. And they lived in the garage, and the house, I guess, was finished before I was born. And in those days, there was no running water. We had outside plumbing, and that was kind of a cold walk during the night, during the night you didn't use commode, but during the day, and then come Halloween, of course, it was always knocked over by the young kids in town. The young boys had a ball. And also on Halloween in those days, the young boys would go, and we would find some of my dad's farming things. They would take the wheels off, and how they ever got on top of the barn, I don't know. There would be my dad's harvester thing up on top of the roof of the barn in the morning. And finally, I can remember the day that the man came in and put electricity in our house on the condition that you had to buy an electric stove. So we had an electric stove with the 4 burners and the 2 ovens, and it had nickel legs, and it had nickel trim all the way around.
Okay.
And whenever my mother didn't have anything else for us to do, we had to polish the nickel. And that nickel you could use for a mirror
Mhm.
to see if your hair was straight or something. It was really funny. We laugh about it now, how no matter what day it was or what time of the day, but if there were a couple idle hands, well, I polished the nickel. That's what we did. And then, in those days, well, then of course we um, had the water put into the house, and they added on an addition to the house and built a bathroom. And I can remember that. Wow. We were about the first people in the church that had an inside bathroom. And boy, were we proud of that. We didn't have to go out to the outhouse anymore for with the Sears Roebuck catalog sitting there for you instead of toilet tissue. I mean, there was no such thing as toilet tissue or saran wrap, baggies, nothing like that.
Wax paper?
There was wax paper, but not like the wax paper that we have today. The wax paper came in square sheets that were folded in half in a package. It was very, very thin, but we didn't know any better,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And then we had a cow, always had chickens, and once in a while we'd find a nest out in the weeds where a chicken had decided to lay all its eggs. And my mother used to always call that a Britse kip. That was an angry chicken.
Hmm.
And of course then we were told, don't disturb that. Wait until the eggs hatched, because that would just be more chickens that my dad would have. But of course you couldn't eat those eggs, you know. And then I remember, my oldest brother Andrew getting married. And in those days they had what they called chevaliers.
Oh, what's that?
You know what that is? And
Now tell me about it, because they don't do that anymore.
they don't do that anymore. And it was really funny. All the young men would get together. And boy, if anybody knew anybody in any of the towns, South Holland, Lansing, Munster, no matter where, they'd all come together. Because, of course, we were all small communities. And they would go to wherever the reception was, which was usually the bride's parents' home. And you'd hear this clanging on wash tubs and everything. And they absolutely would not leave until you paid them money. And you gave them money, and then they left. And what they did with their money, I don't know, but they sure had a high old time.
Did you have any work that you did on the farm when you were growing up?
I certainly did. Asparagus is a spring
Mm-hmm.
vegetable. And I can remember before school, we had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. And we had to go up one row and down the other with what they called an asparagus knife. And you put that in the ground. And you cut the asparagus, and then you had a couple rows over where you would lay it straight. There would be one row, you know, where we would keep it piled. And then they would have, the older ones would have crates that they would lay it on and carry it to the warehouse. But by the time we were ready to go to school, we were already tired. And then we had, of course, on Tuesdays and Fridays, we had to churn the buttermilk. And we had to take turns. My sister Martha and I especially, it was our job to churn. We'd each turn the wheel 100 times.
And then after 200 times, would it be butter?
Oh,
Or would you have to take a couple more turns?
Oh, no, it went on forever, it seemed. And so sometimes went on longer than what we thought. Martha would get a little hot water and pour it in. And then that seemed to make the butter hold on to the wooden paddles a little better. And then we were finished. Once in a great while, she would put in too much hot water. Or the water was too hot to start with, maybe. And then my mother would come down to see whether or not we were finished churning, and she'd take one look at it, and she'd say in Dutch, you know, you put water in it again, didn't you? And we'd both look at each other. Well, we'd have to confess we did, because she could tell the difference. But anyway, then after the butter was, turned, then she had a wooden bowl with a paddle, and she would take that butter, and I got so I could do it too, and you just kept working it to work all the water out of it, and then she molded it. And Martha never ate butter. She saw my aunt make butter once. She liked butter when she was real little, but she saw my aunt make butter one time, and she saw what it was made out of. Well, then she wouldn't eat butter anymore, and to this day, she will not eat butter, or she will not eat margarine.
Interesting. Okay. Now, did Grandma have certain days, like was the wash done on a Monday? And
Wash was done on Monday, whether it was raining, snowing, 10 below, 20 below. Those clothes got hung on the line.
outdoors?
Outdoors, we had lines strung all through the backyard, and then into the pasture. My dad had put posts, so we had 4 posts, and we would hang up the sheets, and the sheets would freeze. The long underwear looked cute hanging on the line, froze solid, but all of that was hung outside. And even when it was frozen, then eventually we would take it in. You would be surprised how dry most of it was, except maybe just the ends. And then, of course, in those days, there was no permanent press, so everything had to be sprinkled, with water, rolled up, put into a basket. And it really, Monday, if you got all the laundry done, that was about all you had time for. Then on Tuesday, you had to do the ironing. Of course, then my mother also had certain things that you did on. You had Monday's work in the house that you did. You dusted this or that. On Tuesday, you did the ironing, and she baked bread, 8 loaves at a time. Every Tuesday and Friday, 8 loaves of bread. And on Wednesday, we did what we called Wednesday's work, which is about like our house cleaning now weekly. I mean, you ran the sweeper, you dusted everything, but come Friday, when you did the regular cleaning, I mean, every knick-knack that was on anything in the house, every knick-knack was brought to the kitchen and washed and so forth. All the lampshades were taken off and brought in, brushed, dusted. And when it came to spring house cleaning, that was another thing. My mother insisted that we wax the furniture with Johnson's car wax. I mean, it was polish that you put on, and you had to rub and rub and rub, and don't you dare leave a streak. And then we had the 4 bedrooms upstairs. When you spring cleaned, why, down the steps came the mattresses. On Friday, by the way, when we did weekly cleaning, there were Pullman rugs. They called them Pullman rugs because it was a carpeting that came out of the Pullman cars from the trains that they had in those days when they traveled from one place to the other. Well, you were able to buy remnants, and they were sewn together, so that's why they were called Pullman rugs, from the Pullman Railroad Company, Pullman cars. And those had to be hauled down, and we had a wire line hanging outside. And so my sister Grace supervised us younger ones. And she would have your dad, my brother John, and I, we each had a carpet beater, which was a handle thing that had a wire effect on it at the end. And so we would have to beat those carpets, both sides, real good. So we were little, we could hardly reach the tops, and we'd start at the top and beat and beat and beat and beat and beat. And, well, then we would think we were all through. So she would come out there and she'd say, "Are you all through?" We'd say, "Yes, we are." And she would take that carpet beater and give it one swat. And there would come this cloud of dust. And she says, "No, you're not finished. Beat some more." So we had to beat some more till no more dust came out. I mean, we had this kind of like a Bissell sweeper. See, some of this is before electricity. See, so you had this a hand sweeper, and that's all you had. So
And
that's
it
what
would only pick up the surface.
they'd only pick up the surface, and then at night, before we had electricity, we had a lamp in the hall upstairs, and the last one to bed had to turn the light off so that you wouldn't have a fire. So it was really, when they put electricity in it was just a miracle. I mean, who could believe that, man, there's a light up there. All you have to do is turn on the switch.
But I love the old things better than the new things. I think candlelight is beautiful. Did anyone notice that the electricity was not as pretty as the candlelight?
I don't know. I think probably the fact that every morning all of those lamps, don't forget, had to be cleaned.
Every morning?
Oh, yes. The wick had to be trimmed just so, because otherwise it would smoke. All the chimneys had to be washed and then you had that smell of the kerosene burning.
Okay.
Really, I'm surprised that more people didn't get carbon monoxide poisoning in those days from the lamps.
Okay.
And as a very small child, after we got the electricity, whenever we had a real bad storm, like our new electric stove got struck by lightning quite often, and we could see the spark come right through. There was a dial on the oven to set the temperature gauge, And so then every time it started to storm, my mother got every one of us kids out of bed from upstairs, no matter how old or how young you were. And we all sat around the kitchen table with the electricity was turned off. She'd go down and pull the switch, and she'd light the kerosene lamp in the middle of the table. And we sat there half asleep, waiting for the storm to go over. And we'd hear the thunder getting farther and farther and farther away. And finally, we could all go back to bed. And I have to tell you then that after we were married, the first storm we were married in January. Well, the first storm we had in the spring started to thunder and lightning. So I poked Don and I said, "Don, we have to get up." He said, "Get up. It's in the middle of the night." And I said, "Well, but it's storming."
My parents still did that with me too when I was little. When we had a storm, I can still remember Dad, this must have been spring of 1956, Dad and Mom and John and I had gone to a chiropractor, Dr. Bashir, in the Roseland area, about 111th Street, not quite Roseland. And he had picked some beautiful red leaves that they liked so much. And so maybe that night or whatever, there was a storm, and we were all sitting in the living room on the sofa, and there were those red leaves. We found out later they were poison sumac. Very pretty red leaves. But no, my parents too would make us sit up for storms. Were they worried that the house was going to catch on fire from the electricity and we wouldn't be able to
They
run out?
remembered not having electricity and then getting electricity. That was a new thing. And at the other house, the old house before I was born, that house was struck by lightning one time. And we didn't have electricity. I wasn't there, but anyway, there was a fire. So my mother had a fear of lightning. And so I can understand. But Don just absolutely thought that I had really flipped my cork when he says, "Well, we got to get up. It's storming." He says, "No, you don't get up early." He says, "You just stay in bed." But also,
Okay, so going back to chores and what it was like back then, canning your food, did you do any canning?
did we do canning? Honey, there was not one thing that we did not can. My mother had 2-quart jars, not pints or quarts, but 2-quart jars. And we canned everything. The only thing that my mother bought was green peas. And I think that's because my dad didn't raise them on the farm, and also because you have to shell each one of those, and
Taking forever.
it would take forever, and you didn't use that many of them. But We just canned absolutely everything, everything. Carrots and beans and all the fruits, the pears, the peaches, applesauce, everything. And in the fall, we had a fruit cellar, big fruit cellar. The shelves would just be completely filled with everything. Pickles of all kinds. French pickles, pepper hash made out of green peppers, and chili sauce, tomato juice, you name it, tomatoes. But in the fall, then my dad would get so many bags of potatoes and so many bushel of apples and keep them in there so that we had uh, fresh apples and potatoes for the winter. And then the carrots and cabbage. He built a warehouse made out of concrete blocks, and it had the double windows. It was really kind of ahead of the period, really. I mean, it was really well insulated. Kept real cool in the summertime, and in the wintertime, everything, things didn't freeze. My dad kept his onion sets in there that he grew until he sold them. But he would have baskets of carrots and baskets of cabbage in there, covered with dirt. And it was just like eating fresh vegetables when you dug them out.
Hmm.
Um,
Tell me more about dinner time with that many children in the family.
well, dinner time was a lot of work because my mother had very large pans, and we were 10 children plus my mom and dad around the table. So if you figure just one potato per person, one for the pot, there were a lot of potatoes to peel. And we never bothered to mash the potatoes because it was just too many. But we always did have potatoes, and we had meat and gravy, and then of course we had the vegetables, either ones that my mom had canned or the carrots or the cabbage or something. And for dessert, it seems like we either had some kind of a pudding because we had the milk, and we ate a lot of whipped cream because we had the cream from the milk. And they did a lot of baking. We always had cake a couple of different times a week. The older girls would make the cakes, not fancy ones, but spice cake or.
I remember a war cake.
Oh, I still make that. I still make that every time we go on vacation. And I sent one to my grandson Eric in Taylor. He was tickled to death when he got that war cake. I still make that
Okay,
war cake.
I want that recipe. Why was that so good?
Well, that was a recipe that was developed during the First World War because it was eggless, milkless, butterless cake.
Okay.
Okay, it took lard. And you see, people in those days would butcher, which is where we got our meat, by the way. My dad would, my mother, first of all, would save all the dimes that came into the house and put them in a tin can. And I can still see the tin can. It had pictures of nuts on the outside. It must have been a little gift that someone gave her, a can of nuts. But all the dimes went in there. And in the fall, they'd count the dimes. And then my dad would go to some other farmer, and he would usually take my one uncle along who didn't drive, which is my mother's brother, lived 2 doors down, had a farm there too. And they would buy the hogs and bring them home. And my dad would kill them because my uncle didn't quite have the strength that my dad did, and they had to hang them up overnight to bleed. And then they would can the meat. The bacon was not smoked like it is today. It was cured with salt, so when you ate it, it was really salty. And it did the same thing with beef. They chopped it up, put it in fruit jars, and they just gave it the hot water bath. And oh, that was really delicious. That the beef. And then my mother always made head cheese out of the certain part of the head of the hog.
The brain, right? Was it the brain?
I never liked it. I didn't even like the smell of it. Now, some of my other sisters really liked it, but I never liked it, the head cheese. But nothing went to waste. And we rendered the lard, and I know how to render lard. You just grind it up, and then you just kind of fry it out slowly. And you end up with kind of like cracklings. Now, I never ate them, but my sister Martha liked the cracklings. And then that lard you would just put in a crock or something and put it in a cool place so it wouldn't get rancid. And if you need to bake that there war cake I was telling you about, you see, you had the lard.
Mm-hmm.
So then all you had to do was have water, and you took that lard and raisins and you spices, cinnamon and cloves, I think maybe a little nutmeg, and you boiled that together for about 5 minutes, and then you added your flour and baking soda, and you got a great big cake out of that, and it was good, and it stayed moist, and that's why we called it war cake, and some people called it the depression cake, because really you have those ingredients in the house when you're on the farm.
Okay. I just can't imagine 365 days in a year, how many cans and cans she must, or jars she had for canning.
I think one time us kids counted it was over 1,000, but you have to remember that in the spring we would have asparagus and maybe spinach, and my dad grew head lettuce, so we did have lettuce for just a short time, but it was fresh head lettuce. And then Zansters down the street raised cauliflower, and my dad had red cabbage, so we switched. That was during the summer, we didn't have to use that.
Mhm.
But and we also froze corn. Now you mean corn? I mean how many 2-quart jars and how many ears of corn we had to do? You cut that all off, and you pushed it down into the jar until the milk of the corn came up. And you put a teaspoon of salt in that, and then you did it in the hot water bath. And then we have grapes, and so my mom would always make grape jelly. We had the grapes, and we weren't allowed to eat them. And also, we had black currants.
Why weren't you allowed to eat the grapes?
Well, she needed
Only
them
for the jelly. Okay.
I mean, once in a while we could have maybe a couple, but I mean, save those for the jelly because winter's a long time, and we had all those lunches to pack. And in those days, lunch meat and stuff like that was just,
It's expensive now.
I mean, it was just an impossible thing,
Mhm.
you know. And that's why they made the head cheese, too, because some of the kids liked the head cheese for sandwiches. Well, I didn't. I just as soon have just a piece of plain bread. But then we had the black currant bushes. I would say maybe we had about 8 or 10 of them. We also had some fruit cheese, but they didn't do too good because, you know, my dad was farming vegetables. And if you want to have an orchard, you've got to spray and you've got to trim. But we did have a peach tree that gave a few peaches that we were allowed to eat and a few apples. But the black currants, my mother made wine out of the black currants. And she had a regular crock. It must have been about 4 feet high. It had a narrow neck and then a great big thing. And you put the currants in there, and what else she put in, I don't know, probably water and sugar or something, but anyway, had a cork, great big cork on it, and it would ferment, and then I can remember when I was a very, very small girl, that there were no phones, so in the evening, maybe a car would come in the yard, and you'd have company, and so my mother would get out the wine glasses, and she'd pour a little wine in these glasses, and for the ladies, she always added a teaspoon of sugar.
I would think it'd be sweet enough.
And then in those days, they made what they called budiones.
Yes, tell me about that.
Well, that's made out of whiskey and raisins. And I don't know all the other ingredients. I made it once, and Don says that's a waste of good liquor. So I never made it again. But I can remember as a little girl going to the Scaringas overnight, and they got company while I was there. And so Mrs. Scaringa went and got the Budiongas, and she poured all the couple that came, the older couple and her husband and herself, a glass of the Budiongas, but she gave us kids the raisins. Pretty soon she came in the kitchen and she wondered why us kids were making so much noise. And I think it's because the raisins had more alcohol in the Budiongas. But we had a lot of fun in those days too. You make do with what you have, and they didn't have the games that they have today. But we would play eeny over the barn, catch, and hope that the ball didn't go in the manure pile. But there were certain chores we had to do at night. The eggs had to be gathered out of the chicken coop after school. My mother had a regular basket, and so once in a while there would be a chicken, sitting in the little nest there, and he wouldn't let you grab the eggs, and if you'd try to get it, he'd pick at your hand. But my mother always insisted, no, we had to get all those eggs because she was scared that chicken would lay all of the eggs, and then, we needed all those eggs. I mean, 1 egg per person would take a lot of eggs. And then quite often on Sunday, we would have fried chicken for dinner. Really, I would say most Sundays. And when I was young, my brother John and I would be the ones that would have to pluck the chicken feathers off of the chickens.
And how many would you have to have for a meal?
Well, we used the
3 or-
roosters, and usually if the roosters were big, we could get by with 2 roosters. Because they were big. Those were big chickens in those days. And so here my brother John and I would be standing with that bucket of hot water, and we'd have to be dunking that thing in there. And if you never did it, you can't imagine the smell from that chicken. And we had to pluck all those feathers off, and we couldn't wait to get them all off. And then we'd bring it in to my mom, and she'd cut it all up. Well, then when I was first married, that was during the Second World War, when meat was rationed and we could hardly get any meat. But there was a lady down the street that raised chickens. So the landlady that we were renting from said to me, I talked to Miss So-and-so, and she said, we can come down every week and get a chicken. So, okay, I put down Carl in the wagon, her little girl, and we walked down the street to this lady's house. And so we said, well, we decided that we'd like to have a chicken every Saturday for Sunday dinner. Well, she said, but I don't kill those chickens. I don't touch them. She was a very dignified little lady, very sweet, had no children. So I said to Vera, our landlady, I said, well, Vera, what do you know about killing chickens? Anything? She said, no. I said, well, I know how to do it. I said, she said, you do? I said, sure. I just would wring their neck. And,
Would you really? You did that?
I really did. I would just wring their neck and just drop them down and just let them hop around a while after they don't have their neck. And then that blood just kept squirting around. And then pretty soon they'd flop over. So then we'd take them home, and then we went through the same process of the boiling water. She did hers and I did mine. And then I had to chop it up. And I got pretty good at it. If Don cut up the chicken, he wouldn't eat it the next day. But that didn't bother me. I'd be hungry enough the next day to eat it anyway. So once in a while, we'd be fortunate enough when we got inside the chicken, there would be an egg in the chicken.
Oh, how unusual.
What a bonus that was. I mean, here we got an egg. and the chicken didn't lay. It was not quite ready. It would have laid the eggs, so we got them in the morning. It would have probably laid them about noon or something. So we got an egg out of there. We thought, boy, we really hit it that week. We got an egg along with our chicken. And we're probably getting ahead of ourselves, but while I'm talking about the war, why gas was rationed, tires were rationed. I mean, you just run bald tires, and unless you worked in a defense plant, you could not get a tire. Shoes, and Don Carl's feet grew so fast, and they wouldn't give me any more stamps, so my mother would give me stamps because their shoes didn't wear out well, actually his didn't wear out, he just outgrew them.
Mm-hmm.
Coffee was rationed. Nylon hose were impossible to buy because they were using the nylon for the
Okay, sure.
paratroops, And you could not buy material. You couldn't buy sugar. Soap was impossible to buy. Coffee was rationed. And I finally had to change grocery stores because the grocery store I was going to, which was a relative, was saving everything for other people, thinking as a relative I would continue to come back. You had blue and red tokens for canned goods, and you had certain tokens for meat. So you were very limited. And like I say, soap, I mean, you needed soap for washing. So then I went to another store, and that man was kind enough that he kept things in the back room for me. And then, since soap was so hard to get, I made my own laundry soap.
How did you make it?
I rendered out the fat. I had a butcher that gave me the waste fat that normally a waste company from Chicago would pick up at all the grocery stores. And I rendered out the fat. A landlady and I worked together. She had the crock, and I had the fat. And we bought the lye. And I don't know all the other ingredients.
Ash? Don't you use ash?
No.
No?
But we had to bring something, we had to heat something together, and then we had to keep stirring the stuff while we were putting the lye in there. And we didn't want the Don Carl and her little Judy nearby for fear that, because they were so small, it could damage their eyes, Well, we were all through. We put it in pans, sort of like a 9 by 13
Okay.
metal pan. And when it got hard, it was as white as ivory soap. And when we went to use it, we would grate it, put a little water on it, and put it on the stove to kind of dissolve it before we put it in our washer. And we had the whitest clothes in the neighborhood.
Interesting.
And I did that more than one time. And I still have the recipe in my file. I looked it up the other day. But I stood in line many, many times, and we had a lady that worked at J.C. Penney in the neighborhood, and she would let us know when J.C. Penney was getting material in. Vera did not drive. I had a little coupe, Studebaker, and we'd pile in that Studebaker. She had 2 girls, and I had Don Carl. And the 5 of us in that car, and we'd drive downtown Hammond, get there before the store opened, and get in line with all 3 kids. And wait. When the store opened, down you'd go to wherever it was downstairs, fabric was. You did not get to pick your color. You did not get to pick how many yards. You took what they gave you and were tickled pink. And I stood in line. She would come over and she'd say, I hear the store in Hessville has sugar. So we'd dash to Hessville and we would buy sugar. And it was really, when the war was over and you could pull up to the gas pump and say, fill it up, you just felt like you were a millionaire, because before you'd have to, well, how many stamps do we have left? How many gallons of gas can we buy? And you didn't dare go for a joyride. I mean, no trip that was not necessary was made. That car had to sit there because you only got very, very few gallons of gas.
Now, getting back to growing up with such a large family, who did the sewing? And how did you get dish towels and things like that when you were growing
Well,
up?
all the dish towels. See, in those days, you bought your feed, and during the war, for some reason or other, instead of having the old burlap sack, during the war, they had beautiful prints, and people, when the grain was gone, would take that and make dresses out of those. Then your flour for baking came in cloth bags, and you would undo that, and in our pantry was a flour bin, and it would hold that 25-pound bag of flour. So whenever the grocery man of those days came to the house, took your order, and delivered it in the afternoon. And when that flour would come, my mom would dump it into that flour bin, and then she would soak it to get all the print off of it. And likewise, sugar came in the cloth bags, and she would soak those and wash them. They're beautiful white, and we made hankies. Us younger girls learned to sew by making hankies out of the sugar bags, and we made the dish towels out of flour bags. And you know, I still use those flour uh, sack towels today. I just got so used to using them that I like them.
Yeah, and they're lint-free.
They're lint-free, and I buy them now from the local Oakland church, and I buy them by the dozen. And I mean, it's a hard habit to break, because when my daughter-in-laws come here, they don't really think that those are towels for drying dishes, because they weren't brought up that way. But any time we had a spare minute, my mother always found something for us to sew. She was trying to teach us at a very young age to pedal the old Singer sewing machine. My sister Hilda, when I was a little girl, learned to sew by making doll clothes. We had an extra bedroom upstairs at one time for a short period of time. And in there we had an old sewing machine, and she would sit up there by the hour making doll clothes, and that's how she learned to sew. But my mother made all of our clothes. We never had any bought dresses. One time